Welcome, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. China has been flexing its muscle throughout the Pacific this week. Should we be impressed or concerned? Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
China's Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, has been on this whirlwind tour throughout the Pacific Islands this week, trying to get those nations to sign up to an economic and security agreement.
Yeah.
Now, our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has talked down the importance of that tour. Is she right to do that?
I think it's consistent with the government's position that they want to deal with Chinese presence in the context of the region itself, rather than linking it to a wider geopolitical angle. The Prime Minister's been careful, as she puts it, not to pigeonhole China alongside Russia. I think the position on Russia is much more hardline, because Russia, through the eyes of our government, has basically ripped up the UN Charter and violated some of the fundamental understandings of international politics, namely territorial integrity and state sovereignty. And I think the Prime Minister is careful to try to distance China from that sort of behaviour. So I do think there's a distinction there in the Prime Minister's mind, and I think her position of downplaying the Chinese presence is not that she doesn't share the concerns of the United States and Australia, but I think she believes the way to deal with it is to try to give the Pacific Island states the wherewithal to push back themselves. They are sovereign states, after all, as she constantly reminds us. So I think from her point of view, the reason she's, if you like, playing down the Chinese menace in the way it's being depicted in Australia and the United States is she feels that may be playing into the hands of China, because China will present itself as the protector of the sovereignty of the Pacific Island states who are threatened by what they call imperial forces led by the United States.
Right, that's interesting. In this proposed agreement, is there a requirement for those Pacific Islands that sign up to support the one China policy regarding, say, Taiwan?
I think that goes almost without saying, and most of these countries already support it. My understanding is all these countries have already indicated, they've opted to recognise China and not Taiwan. We discussed the Solomons a few weeks back, and the Solomons leader, Mr. Sagavari, he basically, when he became leader of the Solomons, the Prime Minister in 2019, he abandoned the policy of supporting Taiwan or recognising Taiwan and switched recognition to China. So those 10 states that have been targeted by this economic and security package, it's a multilateral and very ambitious package which is targeting 10 Pacific Island states. They will all be countries, I believe, that will already recognise China. So they're seen as, if you like, amenable to Chinese diplomacy.
Also this week, China flew 22 jet fighters and other military aircraft in airspace near Taiwan. How significant was this readiness patrol, as China called it?
Yes, it's part of an ongoing issue that's facing Taiwan. There's been the Chinese, the People's Republic of China have conducted incursions into the airspace around Taiwan quite regularly. And this was a sea and air operation, this so-called combat readiness patrol. It was a direct response to Mr. Biden's comment when he was in Japan that if there was military action against Taiwan, United States by China, the United States would get militarily involved.
Right.
And some people interpret that as a departure from the one China policy.
And I wanted to ask you about that, because that's been the big question. Was Joe Biden's comment, was it an official statement? Was it a slip of the tongue? What would be your take on that?
No, I don't think he sees it as a departure, but he's warning the Chinese that the American understanding of the one China policy is a consensual one China policy. So you may say this is splitting hairs, but when the one China policy was put together, relations between China and the United States were basically improving, and there was there was an improving climate of trust. And I think the Americans have always understood that if Taiwan wanted to rejoin with China, that's fine because it's part of China under the One China policy. But I think what the Americans are saying is that if China is now thinking about using force, it should think again to bring about that policy. So, and I think Mr. Biden, of course, used quite tough language about Mr. Putin, saying he shouldn't really stay in power, which ruffled a few feathers. I think what Biden is doing is saying to authoritarian leaderships, don't think we're a soft touch, and don't try and push your luck too much regarding Taiwan. And of course the Japanese were delighted by this message, as was the Taiwanese government, because it gave them more reassurance than they had previously got.
After Jacinda Ardern's 90-minute meeting with Joe Biden, she said that New Zealand and the US were very, very good friends. Was this a signal to China?
Well, I think the United States and New Zealand have seen each other as very, very good friends for a long time, going back to 2007 when the same phrase was used by, in fact, 2004, I think, it might have been earlier, around that period, when Colin Powell, then Secretary of State, said New Zealand and the United States were very, very good friends. So there clearly has been an improvement in the relationship since then. I think what the Prime Minister is signalling when she uses this language is that on the basics, the United States and New Zealand are much closer than they are on key political values like respect for pluralist democracy and human rights. And I think the Prime Minister is signalling to the Chinese that we want to be friends with you, but don't forget that we do share fundamental values with the United States. And I think while the Prime Minister is once again saying, as she did in the United States several times, New Zealand's foreign policy is fiercely independent, she's making it clear that China, if it continues to try to put pressure on the Pacific Island states to sign this multilateral agreement, it's in danger of creating a convergence between New Zealand and the United States. And really, it's a way of saying the ball is in your court. If you want to become more aggressive, well, don't be surprised if we will defend the values which are central to us because they coincide with that in the United States. But that's slightly different from saying that we're just in lockstep with the United States because we've been told so, as the Chinese media is saying overnight. They are depicting the joint statement between Biden and Ardern as a question of Ardern being sort of marched into line and buckling under pressure, relentless US pressure. Well, I don't see that at all. And I think it's, from New Zealand's point of view, it's very much in our interests that the Pacific Island states have the right to make their own mind up about things. But, you know, the Chinese... I think the other point that should come out of Jacinda Ardern's comments about China is that China's not going to go away. It's a second superpower. We can't contain it. What we can do, and I think I'd like to see some action in this area, I think New Zealand and Australia can, perhaps with American support, begin to address those issues that matter to Pacific Island states, such as climate change. The Australians are making a lot of haste now because they are conscious, the new Labour government in Australia is conscious that the Pacific Island states had got very frustrated with Scott Morrison's government because they couldn't get the Scott Morrison's government to empathise with what they think is a fundamental threat to their very existence, which is climate change. And it is, because given the rising sea levels, after all, the Pacific states are likely to be the first victim, or one of the first victims of climate change, and they did nothing to create it. So they're frustrated. If you can reach out, address that frustration and do something tangible about it, it will give those countries the pushback, the ability to push back against Chinese encroachment. In other words, I think Jacinda Ardern is saying to Australia and the United States, we absolutely share your values, but we think the best way of combating the Chinese presence is not a new form of containment. It's a way of responding to the concerns on the ground of the states there, so that they don't feel like they've got. Give them options, so they don't feel like they're in a position where they've got no choice but to accept Chinese largesse to deal with the problems that matter to them, such as climate change.
Do you think there's the potential that, because the Pacific Islands are still to make up their mind on this proposed agreement, aren't they? Is enough being done quickly enough to give the Pacific Islands an option of not coming increasingly under the influence of China?
Penny Wong has been pretty active since she became Foreign Minister. I think she made a visit to Pacific Island states, Fiji. I think Fiji was the destination of her first visit. Almost immediately after being elected, literally got on the plane. So, yes, but I think Australia's position in relation to the Pacific Island states is slightly different from New Zealand's. Our Foreign Minister has taken a bit of heat from previous Foreign Ministers for not doing enough. But, you know, the interesting thing is that Foreign Minister Nanaia Mahuta made it an absolute top priority to improve relations with the Pacific when she came in. I think she's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. There's no substitute for face-to-face diplomacy, but you can also build up a good relationship through constant contact behind the scenes, email and telephone and Zoom. All this is important, and I think the Foreign Minister puts a great deal of store in constant relationships, and you can't constantly be visiting the region. But I think, maybe the government needs to be more visible. It's interesting to see how it pans out. It seems to me that we may, and this is a sort of non-political point, if I may put it this way, we may as a country have to say that whoever's Foreign Minister, and this is not a criticism of Nanaia Mahuta, but whoever's Foreign Minister perhaps should be freed from the burden of other ministerial roles. It's such an important position for this country. At the moment, Nanaia Mahuta is carrying a big burden with local government. So she's got several portfolios. Maybe the job is so important that should be the sole focus. And I know a number of commentators have said that. But I think we probably underestimated the importance of foreign affairs in the past as a country. We can see now with developments in our region, we should probably not do that in the future.
How do the Pacific Island states view this rivalry between the US and China?
They possibly view it as an opportunity. After all, I mean, the United States, New Zealand and Australia largely had the Pacific Island states to themselves for much of the post-45 period. But since 2006, since China has seen its power dramatically enhanced and it's risen to superpower status, it's now beginning to take quite a deep interest in what's a strategically located area, Pacific Island states. So I think they may well seek to maximise support. And we've seen this with the Solomons already having a security agreement with Australia and has one with China now. And I think as a sovereign state, they, in a sense, may feel that they can maximise support for what would be otherwise very limited resources.
Do you think our government is sensitive to that view?
I think the government is sensitive to this view because we've done it ourselves in a way, the way we've pivoted and balanced our relationship with both two superpowers, China and the United States. But what it does mean, and the message is quite clear, is that if we're going to help the Pacific Island states resist Chinese authoritarian ideas via their economic aid, we need to give them more choices on the ground, which means that we're going to have to step up our assistance and target it at areas where Pacific Island states are very concerned, such as climate change.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.